Well, I'd like to welcome you to another of our noontime lectures. My name is Chuck Smythe, and I'm the Director of Culture and History here at Sealaska Heritage Institute. And this afternoon, we're very pleased to have a visiting scholar who is conducting research into the spiritual aspects of Northwest Coast art and art. Dr. Marie Mauze is a cultural anthropologist and senior researcher at the Centre National de la Recherche Scientifique in Paris.
Not too bad.
And a member, I used to do better at this. And a member of the Laboratoire d'Anthropologie Sociale. She has conducted fieldwork in British Columbia and other communities on Vancouver Island, and has visited a number of communities here in Alaska and done a lot of research at various institutions around the country and in Europe. Her interests include Northwest Coast ethnology and ethnohistory, the anthropology of art, the history of museum collections, and the relationships between museums and Native peoples. She is the editor of Past is Present, Some Uses of Tradition in Native Societies, and co-editor of Coming to Shore, Northwest Coast Ethnology, Traditions, and Visions. Very pleased to have you here. And
Well, thank you very much, Chuck. I'm very pleased to be here today, and I would like to thank Dr. Rosita Whirl, the president at SHI, and Dr. Chuck Smythe, History and Culture Director, for inviting me as a visiting scholar at Sealaska Heritage Institute. Rosita and Chuck organized a workshop with several of the members of the Council of Native Scholars here in town, and this was a very special experience in my research career. I'm also grateful to Nadine Hefner. Yes, she is the manager of the archives and collection at SHI, and I would like to thank you for your patience. I also would like to extend my thanks to the people who have helped me to organize my stay here: Helen and Scott Carley, Laurie Thompson, Paul Gardini and his wife Rhonda. I'm also grateful to James Simard at the Alaska Public Library for sharing some of his thoughts with me. And I feel like I have new friends in Juneau, and it's a wonderful feeling. And thank you to all of you. So my talk today actually won't deal with my current research on Tlingit representation of crest being and other spiritual entities in Tlingit art, but it will offer a specific case study in repatriation, a question that is of great interest to the Tlingit people who have fought for many years for the repatriation of their sacred objects. The case I'm presenting here today is rather unique in the history of repatriation, because it refers to the return of one piece by one individual to a local museum, the Umista Cultural Center in Halliday Bay, in British Columbia, Canada. So the first part of my talk will be dedicated to the most significant elements that will allow you to understand the key moments in the life of the Kwakwaka'wakw Headdress. Let's see. Yes, Kwakwaka'wakw Headdress, and how I was instrumental into its return to the Kwakwaka'wakw people. In the second part of my talk, I will examine how its value or its meaning has changed throughout its life. In that perspective, I'm considering that objects have a social life that is not separable from the way individual and collectivities consider them in their material, symbolic, or imaginary dimensions. I'm referring, of course, to the work of Arjun Appadurai, for the people who know him, and other anthropologists who put forward the idea that the meanings of material objects are constructed within specific cultural context. This means that the materiality of an object or its original function cannot tell anything about its cultural destiny. In other words, the meaning of an object cannot be limited to what it has been made for, because in the end, the material thing or the object itself becomes the virtual sum of its objectification, whether they are successive or competitive. So today I will mainly focus on three specific contexts in which the Kwakwak'awakw headdress successively became an ethnographic artifact, an art object, or rather an object of wonder. We will talk about that later, and an object of cultural patrimony. Yes, the headdress was created in the 1870s or 1880s as a ceremonial object to be exhibited by a Kwakwaka'wakw chief as the privilege in ceremonies related to the potlatch. It was confiscated in 1922 by the Canadian government after the illegal organization of a potlatch that took place in a native village around Christmas 1921. So many participants were arrested. Over 30 chiefs and high-ranking individuals were charged with having violated the potlatch law passed in 1884, which prohibited the potlatch and other related ceremonies. A trial was held in the community of Halliday, which was also the administrative center for where the Indian agent had his residential quarters. The chiefs pleaded guilty and asked the court for leniency, promising to stop potlatching. But in order to prove their good faith, the offenders were instructed to surrender their potlatch regalia. Those who complied with the decision were given suspended sentences, and the other were sentenced or condemned to terms of 2 to 6 months imprisonment. About 450 ceremonial artifacts belonging to chiefs from 9 Kwakwaka'wakw communities were confiscated after the 1922 trial. The confiscated piece came to be known as the Potlatch Collection or the Halliday Collection, after the name of the village where the collection was gathered under the authority of William Halliday, the Indian agent. So what happened to those pieces? There were the confiscated pieces were sent to the Victoria Memorial Museum in Ottawa, now the Canadian Museum of History, and part of the potlatch collection, about 130 pieces, were loaned to the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto to enrich their Northwest Coast, its Northwest Coast collection, which was rather poor at the time in the 1920s. And so the Kwakwaka'wakw received $1,045 in compensation for the surrendered artifacts. So masks were valued at about $2 and rattles maybe 50 cents. So this is how much they got. So the confiscated pieces were supposed to remain the property of the Department of Indian Affairs, and therefore that of the federal government. But however, the Indian agent took the decision or the liberty the freedom to sell 32 objects to the American Indian collector and George Hyde, that some of you know of. And George Hyde had founded the Museum of the American Indian in 1916. So in 1922, he was on a collecting campaign in BC, in British Columbia, and he bought 32 pieces from the potlatch collection. The Indian agents thought that, he claimed that Hyde would pay a higher price for the for the artifacts than the Canadian government. But anyway, somehow, the Hyde chose the best pieces. The transformation mask, the more impressive pieces. But this is not the end of the story. About 13 pieces, I would say, were taken or set aside, quotation marks, by the policeman who had arrested the Kwakwaka'wakw chiefs. And so his name was Donald Engerman, and his wife in 1926 sold at least three pieces to George Hyde. And the Kwakwaka'wakw Headdress is one of those pieces. To go on the story, in the mid 1960s, the Kwakwaka'wakw people began to press the museum in Ottawa for the return of their regalia. And after several years of negotiation, the museum agreed on the restitution of the potlatch collection. But the return of the potlatch collection, actually was one of the first cases in the history of repatriation, long before NAGPRA. The act was passed in 1990, and NAGPRA means Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act. So the NAGPRA mandates the return of sacred objects and human remains to federally recognized Native American Indian tribes. But anyway, the museum in Ottawa agreed on the restitution with the understanding that, first, the collection should be held in trust by a museum and not returned to the owners or the descendants of the owners for fear that the collection would be dispersed or scattered by the sale of the pieces. And the second condition was that since the collection was part of the Kwakwaka'wakw patrimony, it would be housed in an appropriate building with proper museum conditions. But because of internal conflicts among the Kwakwaka'wakw, this is, it's an ongoing story. Two museums were built, and the collection was split, between the two museums. And you know that. According to family and political affiliation, this goes everywhere. So the Kwakwaka'wakw Museum, which is called now the Nuyumbali Society, opened in June 1979, and the Umista Cultural Center opened in Halliday Bay, opened in November 1980. So the bulk of the collection, the house in Ottawa was given back to the Kwakwaka'wakw in 1979, and then the Royal Ontario Museum agreed to repatriate its part in 1987. Then the pieces bought by Hyde, which are now, that were in the National Museum of the American Indians, Smithsonian Institution, were given back, 9, I think, some were given back in 1993, and 17 in 2002, and the other pieces had been sold to private collectors or exchanged with other museums. So, as I said, the Kwakwaka'wakw headdress entered the Museum of the American Indian in New York in 1926, but it was the accession in 1957 to a Mesoamerican art expert from Los Angeles. And somehow, the headdress, made its way to Paris. And it was exhibited in a private gallery in Rue de Seine, Galerie Kershach, and it was sold. And André Breton, who is the founder of the Surrealist movement, bought it in 1965. He died the following year. And as some of you know here, and I know that you know, Breton and his surrealist friends had discovered Northwest Coast art in the 1920s. But there was not many pieces available on the market in Europe at that time. But the great time for them was then when they went to New York during their exile. During World War II. And there, they started to they visited the American Museum of Natural History, Northwest Coast Hall, and with his friend, that's Max Ernst, Yves Tanguy, Roberto Matta, Georges Dutuit, Robert Lebel, and among them was Claude Lévi-Strauss, the anthropologist Claude Lévi-Strauss, who had met André Breton on the boat, on the ship who took them to North America in 1941 or not in 1941. So they visited, of course, the Museum of Natural History, but also at that time they started collecting artifacts. And so they frequented, they visited some curio shops, and one of the most important place where they acquired many pieces was Julius Carlebach. He was an antique dealer, his shop, and it played a key role in providing the European collectors with, these kind of wonderful things. The Northwest Coast mask Carlebach sold to the Surrealists, so came from the Museum of the American Indian, and also he sold also many Yupik masks to the Surrealists at that time. Hai, who was experiencing financial difficulties, was selling artifacts that he considered as duplicates. While in New York, the Surrealists managed to gather small but high quality collection of objects that mainly came from the Hai Museum, and several of those pieces brought back in 1946 to Paris, are now shown in the permanent exhibit of non-Western art in the Louvre, the supposedly temple of high civilization art. So in 1998, I was asked by, you remember the name of the gallery owner, Jacques Kershach? Okay, I was asked by Kershach to examine the Breton headdress. He thought it was Aida, because in France, everything Northwest Coast art that has value is Aida. It's always labeled as Aida, and he thought it was Aida. And he was a very primitive art connoisseur. And the funny story about that is that he had become a good friend of President Jacques Chirac, that he had met on a beach somewhere in some of the island in Oceania. So anyway, Kershach was then in charge of curating the first arts, that's how we call that in France, the first art collection in the Louvre. And Kershach, who knew about the address because he had sold it to Breton, wanted to include it as part of the collection of artifacts who would enter the Louvre. He thought that he credited this piece with credited with a strong pedigree because it had been, it originated from the High collection and it belonged to Breton. And for these two main reasons, the headdress was considered to be sharing some kind of aura with the other Northwest Coast species acquired by Breton and his friends during their exile in New York. So let me show you some of the, very briefly, some of the pieces that, so this is a Kwakwaka'wakw transformation mask that was acquired by Lévi-Strauss, that is in the Louvre. This is the wonderful dragonfly Nishka piece that also belonged to Breton, to Lévi-Strauss, and which is also on exhibit in the Louvre. So this Tlingit helmet was was bought by Max Ernst. But when Max Ernst split with Peggy Guggenheim, so Lévi-Strauss bought the piece. He needed some money. And so this Kwakwaka'wakw house post also was belonged to Max Ernst. So he had bought that piece in New York, but it was didn't come from the High Foundation. So this is also in the Louvre. And I should mention that North America is represented only by Alaska, Yupik mask, and Northwest Coast mask in the Louvre. Okay. So anyway, the headdress had kept a secret that Breton, that Kershach could not be aware of. So I found out that the headdress was part of the, confiscated Kwakwaka'wakw pieces. I was very familiar, of course, with the history of the potlatch collection, because when I started my fieldwork in 1979, 1980, I started my fieldwork in Cape Mudge, the village where the Kwakwaka'wakw Museum had been inaugurated about 6 months before. So I had access to the files, and I was very familiar with the potlatch collection. So anyway, I was able to identify the address as being part of the potlatch collection, but its catalog number, George High collection, they have a very specific way of writing down catalog number, and also by a series of photographs taken at the time of the confiscation that I'm going to show you in a little while. So, having found the controversial origin of the address, of the headdress, I advised the Museum Acquisition Committee not to acquire the address, as the Kwakwaka'wakw may ask for its return to Canada. So the address remained in Breton's estate for a few more years. But then in 2002, I heard that Aube Breton, Aube Elouette, Breton's daughter, was selling her father's collection, was auctioning her father's collection. So interceded with Aube to try to obtain the return of the address to its rightful home among the Kwakwaka'wakw. And to my request, in February 2003, she answered that she and her daughter Una, and I quote, would be very proud to give the mask back to the people whom it had been stolen from, end quote. And later she said, during the repatriation ceremony, she said that, and I quote, returning the headdress was important to me because what it means to natives' efforts to recover their identity. And the address was returned to the Umista Cultural Center in September 2003. So, as you understand, the headdress life story is entangled in a complex network of relations shaped by various agents and also shaped by time and places. The destiny of the headdress is embedded in the history of colonial disempowerment of Native people by the Canadian government from the 1880s on, and in the history of Canadian First Nations struggles to recover their own rights in the last part of the 20th century. The headdress destiny is also related to the history of French intellectual and artist sensibility to primitive art, and especially to Native American art in the 1920s and 1940s. The return of the headdress to the Kwakwaka'wakw people is also directly linked to President Jacques Chirac's project to establish a new department in the Louvre dedicated to art, distant art, or art premier. Chirac's main idea was to take non-Western masterpieces out of the ethnographic museums and admit them in the greatest museum in the world, the Louvre. Bringing them into the temple of civilization would assert, he claimed, and I quote, the equality of culture in the world and contribute to raise the Louvre to the status of a universal museum. The life trajectory of the headdress should also be considered within the framework of new models of practice in anthropology and the development of new types of relationships between Aboriginal people, museum, and anthropologists, as well as the redefinition of cultural patrimony. So now I'm going to deal with the second part of my paper, which is how the status or the meaning of the headdress has changed from 1920s to up today. So So I'm going to focus on three main historical moments: the confiscation and the making of an ethnographic object, its life in Breton studio and being considered as an art object or an object of wonder, and its repatriation and how it became an object of cultural patrimony. So the making of an ethnographic object. So the confiscation of the potlatch collection was the decisive gesture which implemented the irreversible break in the life of Kwakwaka'wakw ceremonial regalia and in the headdress destiny. Their confiscation led to a radical change in their status as the result of having been extracted forever from their original context of production and reception. Once private property associated with mythical knowledge and reflecting spiritual meanings, they became ethnographic specimens, a function that they were not originally meant for. The ceremonial object that belonged to the Kwakwaka'wakw chief, were first gathered in Halliday. So this is a picture, maybe it's earlier in the 1880s. They were first gathered in Halliday. They were piled up in the Indian agent that you see, William Halliday, was piled up in his woodshed for a few days or weeks before being exhibited in the parish hall to be photographed and inventoried. In April 1922, the Indian agent informed that the superintendent of Indian Affairs that he had arranged with the Anglican Church to obtain the use of the parish hall to open the staff up and tabulate it on condition that we allow it to be put on exhibition for a couple of days to pay for the use of the hall. And it is not without irony that the dispossessed Kwakwaka'wakw people were charged 25 cents to enter the parish hall and to take a last look at their ceremonial treasures. In the building, the ceremonial artifacts were right away considered as a collection of scientific specimens by the Indian agent. They were displayed against a white backdrop on benches or on the ground. They were shown and photographed by series or types. And Halliday used what we may consider ill-defined or loose categories, relying neither on the function nor on the meaning of the pieces that were shown in different types of rituals. Then he chose to present the artifacts according to their forms. So you have a series of copper here, and you have what we could get a loose category of face mask, and you see the headdress here, face mask, or like animal mask, and maybe a series with apron and headdresses. This improvised and temporary exhibit aimed at recording the major pieces in order to document the collection. But by virtue of the confiscation, the object of the potlatch collection became divested from their evil nature and immoral potency that where they were supposed to be, and turned into inoffensive objects. They were transformed into objects testifying to the richness of Kwakwaka'wakw culture and ceremonial life. And so they were turned into ethnographic artifacts, which they definitely became when they entered the collection of the National Museum in Ottawa, the Royal Ontario Museum in Toronto, and the Museum of the American Indian in New York. So now, there's a long gap, and now we're going to deal with the headdress in Breton studio in Paris. So, as I said, Breton acquired the headdress in 1965, and he died the following year, in 1966. So Breton lived in a studio, literally people with all kinds of things, masks, fetishes, sculpture from Oceania and the Americas, painting, found objects, roots, insects, pebbles, stones, everything. The assemblage of these multiple things made up his mental landscape, which was submitted to changes. He constantly moved them around to establish new connection between artworks. Breton studio was considered by art historians as a real laboratory for surrealist experimentation. So here you see these are the Yupik masks, and they were in his just above his bed. And so you have now that was his collection of Kachina dolls. So Breton had owned a very he owned that painting. It's the Child Brains by Chirico. And in 1964 he was under financial stress, and he sold it to the painting to the Museum of Modern Art in Stockholm, and he had kept that painting for more than 40 years, and almost throughout all his adult life. And he deeply missed it because it had been the focal point around which he had organized his collection. So with the proceeds of the sale of the painting, he acquired a sculpture from a new island that you see here, called Uli, that he had wanted for 35 years. And so the massive sculpture took place on his desk, keeping watch on the writers, on his desk, keeping watch on him, as well as peopling his imaginative world. So the Uli replaced the greatly missed de Chirico's painting, but actually didn't quite fill the unbearable emptiness left by by it. So Breton added two more important pieces. So to the uli, the tolai figure over there on the left, and also the headdress. The Kwakwaka'wakw headdress. So you see the headdress here. The Kwakwaka'wakw headdress was. Oops. So this is from the back. You can see. So it was kind of a bric-a-brac. I mean, I was very filled with many things. So the Kwakwaka'wakw headdress was sitting on his table, his desk, on a small Haida chest that you can see maybe, and it was facing Breton when he was reading or writing. So maybe I don't have time, to go into the different connection that he established between those different pieces. But in his so anyway, he thought that there was kind of some kind of power coming out of those three pieces that would kind of protect him. So this is what he thought. Breton's sensitive and intellectual approach to art is summarized in a sentence written in 1924 in his book The Lost Steps. He said, "The real meaning of an artwork is not what we believe it is, but it is what it becomes against what surrounds it." Breton was a maker of meaning. He arranged his decor in accordance with an analogical relation he was able to bring out from objects he considered as being endowed with magic qualities. In his studio, artworks were not displayed according to a formalist or aesthetic protocol, but rather according to chains of meaning that would undergo transformations through his own gaze. In establishing connection between objects, Breton took on the role of a magician who led artworks far from their original meaning to recontextualize them in his own poetic world. And he didn't view art objects in terms of aesthetics or beauty, but in terms of their agency on things and people. Breton attributed agency to the headdress, a power that had been lost when transformed into an ethnographic specimen. So now I'm going to deal with the third part. So from Breton's studio, the headdress traveled to Halliday in BC, where the potlatch regalia had been confiscated, as I said, in 1922. So the repatriation ceremony took place on September 21st, the solstice, 2003, in the big house in Halliday. And the celebration started with a big feast and was followed by speeches delivered in Kwakwala by Bill Cranmer, that you see in the middle over there, who was the president of the Umistak Society, and he was also the master of ceremony for the occasion. So the restitution ceremony was specially organized for the occasion. It was in that very case, the headdress was not repatriated by a museum, but as I said, by an individual person, Breton's daughter, which was a rather unique situation. And it was the restitution was staged as a Tlasila peace dance, a ceremony in which high-ranking chiefs displayed their rights to dance with the type of headdress that was given back. And Aube Breton was honored with a name given to her by Chief Bill Cranmer. The name was Uma, which means noble woman, and it means that she did the right thing, that she behaved like a noble woman because she did the right thing in giving back the address. And she was then invited to dance the ladies' dance, and also she was given gifts. She received gifts. So anyway, the crate, I mean the crate when holding the headdress was then introduced into the big house, with drumming, and it was carried by Aube and her daughter Una to be placed in front of the chief bench, and as you see here, Bill Cranmer took out the headdress and lifted it up for the people attending the ceremony to see it. He then proceeded to dance around the fire, accompanied by Aube, Una, and two Kwakwaka'wakw chiefs, with a procession in tow. The participants circled 4 times around the fire, and so they took turns. Another chief also, danced with the headdress. But maybe there might be something that might be of interest to you. Have you noticed something on the picture? It's interesting to think about the Umista Cultural Center staff, and local elders chose to adequately reinstate the address into the ceremonial arena as a public act of reappropriation. The chief put white cotton gloves on to hold the address in their hands, the type of gloves museum staff wear to handle artifacts. The headdress was carried around at chest height and not worn on the chief's heads as in a traditional context. This would have been inappropriate because the name of the owner of the address was not known. The repatriation ceremony coalesced in a very peculiar moment 2 contrastive meanings of the object: the object as a ceremonial object, the address as a ceremonial object, recovering something of its former function or meaning, and the address as a museum artifact. Neither the elders nor the museum staff ever considered to reestablish its original status that had been lost forever. The public assembled that evening was able to witness a unique performance staging the idea that once an artifact has been transformed into an object of ethnography, once it has been decontextualized and defunctionalized, it can never recover its original nature. I know that here the context is different among the Tlingit people. So the Breton's address started a new life at the Umista Cultural Center, and it took on another new meaning. It became an object of cultural patrimony, and together with about 200 or more pieces of the potlatch collection, it was exhibited at the Umista. It became part of an inalienable and collective heritage, a radical innovation that occurred about 30 years ago, testifying to the resilience of Kwakwaka'wakw culture. And this is not the end. So I'm going to show you also the exhibit in the Umista Cultural Center is an open exhibit, as you may see it. So these are with the Hametsa mask, and but having been ceremonially welcomed at the Umista, it was loaned in 2003. It was loaned for a few months in 2011 for the Vancouver Vancouver Art Gallery show entitled "The Color of My Dreams: The Surrealist Revolution in Art," and then it played a new role. It played the role of an ambassador of the French surrealists in its own territory of British Columbia. Thank you very much. Well, that was about.
That's perfect.
Yeah.
So we have time for questions. Or you entertain questions from anyone? I have one.
Okay, start.
I'm wondering, I was really struck by the way you described it at the end as neither going back completely nor giving up all of its qualities from the past. So if they had known the name of the chief or the individual, the title of the individual who had owned it previously, could it have been kind of reinstalled into a ceremonial context or not?
But it was really reinstalled in the ceremonial context because the way they thought about the ceremony was a Tlasila dance. That's the context. I mean the ceremony in which those pieces are are shown. So this is like like here the headdress, where people are dancing and like the peace dance. So, but the thing, I don't know exactly if they had known the owner, probably it would have been the owner's family who would have presented it, probably. But that was, in that very case, it was shown, it was danced by the two presidents of the two museums. So it was more in a kind of an institutional way of reintroducing the address to the community.
So can certain individuals now borrow that item to use in a ceremony?
No. I mean, nobody's using the. No, I know some museum. I mean, have pieces that they loan to the Kwakwaka'wakw or to the native people, but this is this was it's considered as a collective. And a collective property, and it's as a collective property in a tribal museum, and it shouldn't be loaned. I haven't seen any example that it's been loaned, but what I have seen is in the other museum is actually pieces are exhibited in different ways. It is focused more about the family ownership and how many pieces they have. And some people actually have introduced in the display cases some of the pieces that they're using today, just to make themselves kind of big. Yes?
I have a question about the 1922 trial
Yes.
of these individuals. Is there by any chance a transcript of that trial, do you know? Were there any notes taken or a record made of the trial?
Yes, I think so. Yeah, but you could find that in there's many books that are talking about the confiscation. Yeah, but I don't know whether we have like a real transcript of it. But maybe not. I don't know. No, I don't think there were any transcripts. But maybe in the Department of Indian Affairs there should be notes and. Reports on the trial.
I have another question. The wife of the Indian agent Halliday, who sold some of the pieces, did they keep the money, do you know?
Of course. Of course. Yeah. Yes, they did. They didn't give it back to the native people. Actually, some of the native chiefs, Kwakwaka'wakw chief, were so. Some didn't even. Accept it. They didn't accept the money because it was so little that they felt insulted.
So I understand that this was a voluntary repatriation in this case, the wife of Breton.
Yes.
The daughter of Breton.
Yeah.
Volunteered. Does Canada have an analogous law with NAGPRA?
No. But they have understanding with museums. There's a new policy which was put together in the 1990s. And so there's some understanding that, museums are, giving back. But it has to go. They don't give back pieces to individual. It has to go back to a museum, and also repatriation also takes place within the framework of land claims. So, like for the Nishka case, they got many pieces back, but I'm not sure that they have building proper building to house them. So it's maybe still in care of local museum, like or museum close to the communities.
So the tribe has to be recognized through land claims law.
Yeah.
Before they're considered an entity.
But but it's that's how they do it now through land claims. Yeah. Yeah. Yes, Anastasia.
So I'm wondering, just following up on that, if you don't mind answering, it's a little bit of a tangent, but so with the land claims, it's establishing some kind of ownership of the heritage objects that are associated with the land. Is that what you're talking about, or?
Yeah, that's part of this is part of the settlement. That's land and object, what they own. Yeah, more.
So if they're tied to that particular land, then we were talking about.
But doesn't this is not quite the same as the Tlingit people here. That objects are tied to land or to a specific place. It doesn't work exactly the same for them. Yeah, but it's part of a settlement. They're including the repatriation of artifacts, in the land claims.
So what you were talking about earlier, as far as is part of the recontextualization and the the object has changed hands so much and meaning so much that are there cases where the object can actually be repatriated and resume its former context?
Not in the context of, not in Canada, because the pieces are never been are not given back to families. Yeah, so they're not reused. But the problem is, the question is, in Canada, once, for the Kwakwaka'wakw at least, once you are entitled to a privilege, even if the piece is being sold, or you still keep the title, so you can have a new piece made. So you're never losing. You are never. You never lose your privilege. It's transferred, but you never lose it. And if you don't have the physical or the material object to embody it, you can, always have another one made. So
that was going to be my next question.
Yeah.
Okay.
So this is a bit different. Yeah.
Could you give us a little lesson in sort of family ownership and privileges, as compared to clans?
So this is the species are. Well, it's the Kwakwaka'wakw are also divided into chiefs, noble, common, and slave. But actually the pieces are not owned by the lineage; they are owned by the highest ranking people.
So it's individually owned.
They are individually owned, and actually people through marriages. They're kind of. Always trying to expand their, culture. Their symbolic patrimony. So in doing, the right, like a Kwakwaka'wakw chief can marry a few times. So once the marriage compensation is paid, or once there's a kid born, so there's a potlatch and you reimburse the compensation. And then you can marry another woman, which makes you, and you can accumulate more symbolic wealth. So this is how it works. So this was, why, in the at the end of the 19th century and early 20th century, you had, this competition and, between people who are through, distributing wealth, who are trying to have, higher status. And so you do that with, doing the right marriages. So it's owned by, a few leaders in the clan. in the lineage, in the house.
The 1%.
Yeah.
What?
It's the 1%.
Yeah. Yeah.
So the privilege is a name, a title, and the
It's a name, and it's a name, and also different dances that goes with the name, and the myths. I mean, the myths, and yeah. So the chief usually, I mean, is the highest, is the firstborn of the family. So that's how it's transferred. Yes, Ricky.
So do we know what the basis or the foundation or the justification for the law that made potlatches illegal?
Yeah, but it was against Protestant ethics. People would, would work very hard during the summertime and fish and make money and then spend it all, at feast. They were also against, they saw the missionaries said that, people would gather in the wintertime and, there were many people gathering at the same place and it would contribute to spread diseases. There was also, the missionary and were against the Indian marriage, like young women married to, older men, just for the privilege to pass privileges, those kinds of, and it was, like there was some ritual were supposed to be like cannibal rituals, but it was not cannibal, they were biting the arm or something like that, the hametsa. Some mostly, there was also in this chief's competition, there was also some prostitution going on. Chief would prostitute their wives or daughters to get easy cash to buy blankets and other potlatch goods. So there was all kinds of things. But mostly it was against, it was a way of wanting to assimilate people, anyway, yeah. To fight, against the native culture, to make the native people, to make them, like white people.
Enforcement, was it done by military or?
No, it was done by the policemen, but actually the enforcement didn't work very well because the law was passed in '85 and nobody has been arrested before the 1940s, about that 1915. And so the Indian agents saw that, it would say, oh, well, people are not potlatching anymore. But then there was ways of going around the law because people would sometimes what they organized what they called disjointing potlatches. So they would dance and then distribute. The people would go by boat to the different villages and give flour and flour packs or different things. So there was no connection between the ceremony and distribution. So that's how they tried to turn around, the law. And also they did go on actually after the confiscation. This is what they did, yeah. And the potlatch the potlatch law was kind of dropped down. But it was not, in 1951 when there was a new the Indian Act was rewritten, so it was not quite it was not written off, but people were able to start potlatches after 1951, and it's really started in the 1960s again. Yes, Paul?
Is anything known about the people that refused to go along with
they went to jail.
Agreement? And
they went to
jail.
jail.
What happened after they went to jail? And what happened after they were released and came back? And anything about the individuals that?
Well, but I know they went to jail and for 2 months or 6 months, and so I don't know because they hid their pieces. I don't know what they did. Yeah. We don't know too much about that because people tend to talk more about how difficult it was, and people, how terrible it was for those chiefs to be to go to jail and to be insulted and to be put down, and but they came back to their community, and so probably they didn't. I don't know whether they potlatched again or not. So, but it went underground. I mean, potlatching went underground.
Well, thank you very much. That was great.